It was prime-time television, the kind of high-stakes, nationally broadcasted event that networks dreamed of. Millions of Americans sat glued to their screens, waiting to watch what they knew would be an explosive interview. The stage was set. Bright studio lights, polished wooden desks, and a carefully selected audience who had been instructed to keep their reactions respectful, but engaged. Across the desk sat Donald Trump, the man who had dominated American politics and business for decades. He leaned back in his chair, radiating his usual confidence and composure, dressed in his signature navy suit and red tie. Opposite him sat the host, a well-known liberal journalist who had built a career on ambushing conservative figures. She had done this before: the calculated smiles, the subtle digs, the leading questions designed to trap her guests. Tonight, though, she wasn't just hosting any conservative. She was facing Donald Trump. Her network had made their agenda crystal clear. This wasn't just an interview. This was an attack. The producers had spent weeks researching every possible angle, crafting the perfect questions designed to humiliate Trump, expose supposed contradictions in his character, and create the next viral controversy. They were ready for a showdown. Trump, however, had seen this playbook 1,000 times. And unlike other politicians who crumbled under media pressure, he had a different approach. He never played defense, he attacked. The cameras rolled. The show had begun. "Mr. Trump," the host began, her voice smooth but laced with hidden arrogance. "Thank you for joining us tonight. I know you've been quite busy lately." Trump offered a polite nod, waiting. He knew the game. Start friendly, lull them into a sense of control, then go for the kill. The host continued. "You have built an empire, led the nation, and still remain one of the most talked about figures in modern history." She paused, then added, "But let's talk about your personal values." There it was. Trump immediately recognized the bait. He had been through this routine before. The classic mainstream media trap: disguise an attack under the pretense of a conversation about values. But he wasn't about to let her dictate the terms. "You've always branded yourself as a man of strong family values," she continued, her smile polished but her tone unmistakably condescending. "Yet, many Americans question whether your personal life aligns with what you preach." Trump tilted his head slightly, his smirk barely visible. "Ah, so that's the angle tonight." She was laying the foundation, implying hypocrisy, setting the stage for a public attack on his marriage, his character, and his values. The host leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation. "How do you respond to people who say you use family values as a political tool, but don't actually live by them?" It was a trap, a carefully worded, well-rehearsed setup. But Trump was 10 steps ahead. He didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk, and delivered a response that would leave the entire studio speechless. "What's interesting," he said, his voice steady but commanding, "is that people like you, the media elite, the liberal establishment, you love to lecture the rest of us about values, but you don't actually stand for any." The audience stirred. Some exchanged glances. Even the crew members behind the cameras tensed. The host blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She had expected defensiveness, not offense. Trump continued. "You sit here pretending to have some moral high ground, but let's be honest, the mainstream media isn't interested in values. You're interested in narratives." Now the energy in the room had shifted. Trump wasn't playing defense. He was turning the tables. The host's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "So, you're saying criticism of your personal life is unjustified?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Trump didn't hesitate. "I'm saying the criticism is selective," he fired back. "And phony." Now it was the host who had to play defense. But she wasn't giving up just yet. She glanced at her notes. It was time to unleash the real attack. She took a deep breath and asked the question that would ignite the most talked about interview of the year. And what happened next would send shockwaves across the entire country. The host adjusted her microphone, took a controlled breath, and tightened her grip on her cue cards. She knew she had to regain control. Trump was dominating the conversation, and the producers in her earpiece were already panicking. Time for the kill shot. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice carrying a rehearsed sense of neutrality, "let's talk about your marriage." There it was. Trump didn't react. He had been waiting for this. He knew exactly where this was going. The host leaned in as if feigning sincerity. "You and Melania have been married for almost 2 decades now," she continued. "Many admire your relationship, but others, well, they have questions." Trump tilted his head slightly, as if daring her to continue. "What kind of questions?" he asked, feigning curiosity. The host smirked inwardly. He had taken the bait. "Well," she said, flipping through her notes for dramatic effect, "some say Melania is distant, that she doesn't seem happy, that perhaps she's just playing a role." The audience stiffened. The tension in the studio became palpable. Trump leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He was letting her dig her own grave. The host pressed forward, mistaking his silence for weakness. "And there are rumors," she continued, her voice turning dangerously bold, "that you two lead separate lives. That Melania stays with you out of obligation, not love. That maybe, just maybe, the reason we don't hear much from her is because—" Trump leaned forward so suddenly that she froze mid-sentence. "Because what?" he interrupted, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a sledgehammer. The host hesitated for the first time. Trump didn't let her recover. "You see," he said, his voice unwavering, "this is why people don't trust the media anymore." The host's eyebrows shot up. That wasn't the reaction she expected. Trump continued, his voice gaining momentum. "You don't care about my marriage. You don't care about Melania. You don't even care about the truth." The host opened her mouth to object, but Trump steamrolled right over her. "What you care about," he said, "is clicks, controversy, and control. You think you can sit there in your little chair with your little cue cards and dictate how the American people see me, see my wife, see my family." The audience stirred, sensing a power shift. "But here's the thing," Trump continued, voice growing stronger, sharper, undeniable. "You don't get to define my marriage. You don't get to define my values. You don't get to define Melania." The host swallowed hard. Trump leaned in closer. "You know what the difference is between Melania and the so-called powerful women that your network loves to put on a pedestal?" The host remained silent, but her eyes betrayed her. She was losing control fast. "Melania doesn't need to scream for attention. She doesn't need the approval of media elites like you to validate her worth. She carries herself with dignity, grace, and strength, things you clearly don't understand." The audience erupted into applause. The host's face flushed red, but she tried one last attempt to salvage the situation. She forced a smug smile, adjusted her earpiece, and said, "Mr. Trump, I don't think I've ever seen a husband so defensive." Trump laughed, a low, knowing chuckle. "Defensive," he repeated. "No, no, I'm protective. And there's a difference." The host shifted uncomfortably. "You see," Trump said, looking directly into the camera, "I actually love my wife. I respect her. And I don't need to prove that to you or anyone else." He turned back to the host. "But let's be honest," he added, smirking now. "This was never about Melania, was it?" The host blinked, momentarily thrown off. Trump didn't give her time to think. This is about the fact that strong, conservative women terrify the left, he said, his tone now commanding the entire room. Women like Melania, like the millions of mothers, daughters, and wives watching this right now, they don't need your approval. They don't play the victim. They don't scream about being empowered, because they already are. The crowd burst into applause once more. The host was out of moves. She tried to force a laugh, but it came out hollow. She glanced down at her notes, searching for a lifeline. But there wasn't one. Because Trump had just obliterated her entire narrative live, on national television. And he wasn't done yet. The host cleared her throat, desperately trying to regain control of the interview. The studio lights felt hotter now, and her producers were frantically feeding her lines through her earpiece, but nothing was working. Trump had seized control of the room. Still, she wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed. She adjusted her cue cards, plastered on her best composed expression, and tried a new angle. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "I understand that you feel the media has misrepresented your marriage. But let's talk about the bigger issue here." Trump tilted his head slightly, waiting. "There are critics who say your relationship with Melania is, well, transactional." The audience shifted uneasily. The host continued, emboldened by the murmurs in the crowd. "They argue that she stays because of wealth, because of status." She went on, her tone mockingly innocent. "I mean, you're a powerful man. There are people who say a woman like Melania wouldn't be with someone like you unless—" Trump leaned forward so suddenly that she stopped mid-sentence. "Unless what?" Trump asked, his voice calm but razor-sharp. The host hesitated, as if realizing she had just stepped into a trap of her own making. Trump let the silence stretch, let the weight of her own words hang in the air for everyone to witness. Then, with a smirk, he delivered the blow. "You know, it's funny," he said, his voice steady, controlled, and lethal, "how people like you always talk about empowering women, about letting them make their own choices. Until they choose someone like me," the audience murmured in agreement. Trump leaned back slightly, now completely in control. "You see," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "Melania is one of the most accomplished women I've ever met. She speaks 5 languages. She built her own career. She's a mother, a leader, and a role model for millions. But according to people like you," he gestured toward the host, "her choices only count if she makes the ones you approve of." The host's smile twitched, barely holding together. Trump wasn't done. "You sit there and push the idea that women should be strong, independent, and free-thinking," he continued, "but when a woman chooses to support her husband, chooses to stand by him, chooses to embrace values that don't fit your agenda, suddenly she's weak. Suddenly she's a victim?" The audience broke into applause. The host shuffled her cue cards again, but there was no salvaging this. Trump leaned in once more, delivering the knockout punch. "Melania doesn't need your pity," he said, his voice unwavering. "She doesn't need your approval. And she sure as hell doesn't need a lesson in independence from someone who has spent this entire interview trying to tear her down." The entire studio erupted in applause. The host's fake smile completely vanished. She had lost, and Trump knew it. Still, she tried one last desperate move. "Well, Mr. Trump," she said, attempting to force confidence back into her voice, "if Melania is as strong as you say, then why don't we hear from her more? Why does she choose to stay silent while other first ladies have taken a more vocal role?" Trump chuckled a low, knowing laugh. "You mean, why doesn't she spend her time giving interviews to people like you?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Maybe because she has class," the audience roared. The host's face turned an alarming shade of red. Trump smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Some people talk just to hear their own voice," he said, gesturing to the host. "Melania talks when it matters." The audience erupted again, and the host's defeat was now undeniable. Her team was already signaling for a commercial break, desperate to cut the cameras before the damage got any worse. But Trump wasn't finished yet. The host gritted her teeth, her carefully crafted persona crumbling on live television. She had spent years ambushing conservative guests, using loaded questions and selective editing to push her narrative. But this was different. Trump had flipped the script. He was in control now. Still, she wasn't going down without a fight. With a forced chuckle, she tried to redirect the conversation. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, feigning composure, "since you believe Melania doesn't need to prove anything, let's talk about you." Trump raised an eyebrow, waiting. The host shuffled her cue cards, trying to regain her footing. "There's been a lot of speculation," she began, her voice dripping with fox curiosity, "about the state of your marriage. Reports claim that Melania is often distant, that she avoids public appearances with you, that she—" Trump held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. The host froze. "Speculation," Trump repeated, his tone calm but edged with steel. "You mean gossip?" The audience stirred, sensing the shift. "Let me ask you something," Trump continued, his voice slow, deliberate. "Where do these reports come from? Are they from sources that were actually there? Did they talk to Melania? Or are they just unnamed insiders feeding the media the same garbage they've been pushing for years?" The host shifted in her chair. "Well, no, let's be honest," Trump interrupted, his voice cutting through the studio like a knife. "These so-called reports, they're from the same people who spent years lying about Russian collusion, the same people who ran fake stories about me, my family, my business, and now they're desperate for a new scandal." The audience nodded. Some even applauded. The host's smile wavered. Trump leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "You see, this is what the media does," he said, his voice growing stronger. "When they can't attack your policies, when they can't break you politically, they go after your family. They try to turn your wife against you, your kids against you. Why? Because it's easier than facing the truth." The host tried to interject, but Trump wasn't done. "But let's talk about something real," he said, gesturing toward the audience. "How many people watching right now have been married for years? Decades?" Hands went up in the audience. Trump nodded. "How many of you have had a fight with your spouse? A disagreement? A bad day?" The audience chuckled, people nudging their partners. "And did the media run headlines about your failing marriage the next morning?" Trump asked, smirking. The audience laughed, clapped, and cheered. The host's face turned pale. Trump was dismantling her argument, piece by piece. "Melania and we've been through more than most couples could imagine," he continued. "We've had every camera, every journalist, every so-called expert dissecting our relationship, looking for cracks, trying to break us. And guess what?" Trump smirked, leaning back in his chair. "We're still here," the audience erupted. The host looked desperate now, her strategy completely backfiring. But she had one last move left, and it was about to be her biggest mistake yet. She straightened in her chair, narrowed her eyes, and dropped all pretense of professionalism. "Well, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice low, almost smug, "if Melania is so happy, why do we never see her smiling when she's with you?" The room fell silent. Even the producers behind the cameras froze. The audience gasped. Trump tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You mean like this?" he asked, pulling out his phone. He held it up to the camera, a photo of Melania, beaming, laughing, leaning into him at a private event just last week. The audience roared with laughter and applause. Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "You see, this is the problem," he said. "You take one moment, one photo where she's not smiling, and suddenly there's a scandal. But when she's smiling, happy, supporting me, you don't show that. Why? Because it doesn't fit the story you're trying to sell." The host stiffened. Trump smirked. "Maybe that's why nobody trusts the media anymore." The audience stood up, clapping, whistling, cheering. The host stared at her cue cards, completely rattled. She had lost control. And Trump wasn't finished yet. The host sat frozen, gripping her cue cards so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had built her career on ambushing conservative figures, cutting their words to fit a narrative, turning half-truths into full-blown scandals. But this was different. Trump hadn't just defended himself, he had exposed her. He had turned the spotlight around, showing everyone watching exactly how the media worked. And the audience? They knew it too. Trump leaned back, arms crossed, watching her squirm. The host took a shaky breath, forcing a smile. "Mr. Trump, but Trump wasn't done. You know," he interrupted, his voice smooth but loaded with power. "You remind me of every bad journalist I've ever dealt with." The audience laughed. "Oh, you know the type," Trump continued, gesturing to the cameras. "They don't care about the truth. They don't care about facts. They just want the headline." The host tried to regain control. "Mr. Trump, we're simply asking." No, Trump said, holding up a hand. "Let me ask you something." The host blinked. Trump leaned forward, locking eyes with her. Where was this same energy when other first ladies were in office? He asked. Where were the serious questions about Michelle Obama? About Jill Biden? About Hillary Clinton? The audience murmured in agreement. Trump smirked. "That's the thing about the media," he continued. "They don't ask these questions unless the woman in question is conservative. Then suddenly she's weak. She's trapped. She's miserable." The host swallowed hard. Trump shook his head. "But you know what?" he said, his voice quieter now, but sharper than ever. "You don't get to define my marriage. You don't get to define my wife. And you sure as hell don't get to define me." The audience erupted. The host looked lost. She glanced at the producers, begging for a way out, but no one could save her now. Trump leaned back in his chair, giving her a slow, deliberate smile. "And that," he said, "is why America doesn't listen to you anymore." The studio exploded in applause. People stood up, clapping, cheering. Even some of the crew members were nodding in agreement. The host's face turned red. Her career had just changed forever. The producers rushed to cut to commercial. The cameras faded to black, and just like that her trap had backfired. But for Trump, it was just another day of exposing the media. The internet exploded. Clips of the interview went viral within minutes, dominating social media. News outlets scrambled to cover what had just happened, while commentators from all sides weighed in. Conservative voices called it a masterclass in exposing media bias, while even some left-leaning figures had to admit that Trump had turned the tables in a way no one expected. Meanwhile, viewers flooded the network's comment sections. They weren't talking about Trump's answers, they were talking about the host's failed ambush, her condescending smirk fading into panic. And the exact moment she realized she had lost control. As for the host, her reputation took a massive hit. Ratings plummeted, her credibility shattered, and soon enough, she was quietly replaced. What was supposed to be her moment of triumph had become the worst mistake of her career. But Trump? He walked away victorious, just like he always did. If you enjoyed watching Trump flip the script on the media, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. And remember, the truth always wins in the end.